When I finally found peace again, my ex showed up to sabotage my wedding, said, I didn't deserve our daughter, and then. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel new again. Sunlight pouring across the quiet streets of Galveston, the air thick with salt and warmth. And for the first time in years, my heart didn't feel like it was being held hostage by uncertainty. I stood barefoot in my small kitchen, humming quietly as I scrambled eggs, while Ruby sat at the tiny table we'd picked up secondhand during a more fragile time. She had on her favorite blue unicorn pajamas, face still soft from sleep, hair sticking up in wild curls. "Mommy, is today the wedding for real this time?" she asked, voice full of awe and a bit of disbelief, like she still couldn't quite imagine something this good actually happening. I smiled and bent down to kiss the top of her head, brushing some sticky strands away from her eyes. "Yes, baby," I told her. "Today's the day Mommy marries Gavin." Ruby lit up the way only a 6-year-old can, like her whole body became a flashlight, and asked if she could wear the dress with the sparkles and the ribbon that made her feel like a princess. I nodded, heart swelling, though it still felt surreal that we'd made it here at all. Just 3 years ago, I could barely breathe without panicking. When I left Troy, it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like jumping into the ocean with rocks tied to my ankles and hoping someone would eventually fish me out. I'd thought divorce would bring relief, but what followed was war. Troy had always been charming when he needed to be, especially in court. He used my late nights finishing projects as a freelance illustrator to paint me as careless, unstable, unfit. I remember sitting in that courtroom, clutching my knees under the table, while his lawyer dissected my schedule like I was some selfish stranger who'd abandoned her child for fame. Even after the court ruled in favor of joint custody, the damage had already been done. Something cracked open in me, and it didn't close for a long time. Ruby was the only thing that kept me from falling apart completely. But loneliness has a funny way of making you question your sanity, even when you're doing everything right. I'd gone from being someone's wife to being someone's target. My friends tried to help, but eventually they stopped reaching out, some out of discomfort, others because they didn't know what to say anymore. I was drifting through life in quiet panic until one of my old professors suggested a support group, not for divorcees, but for people rebuilding after major life losses. That's where I met Gavin. I'll admit, he didn't stand out at first. He didn't say much during the first meeting, just sat in the back with his arms crossed, looking like he might bolt at any second. But over time, we found ourselves paired off during group activities, and I learned he wasn't quiet. He was careful. Gavin had lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, and you could still see the outline of that grief in his eyes if you looked too long. But he never wallowed in it. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did talk, he always said exactly what he meant, never more. I needed that. I'd had enough of men who talked like they were performing. Gavin didn't perform. We didn't fall into romance quickly. It was slow like thawing ice. We started with coffee after meetings, then walks on the pier, then eventually dinners at my place when Ruby was at her grandparents'. He never pushed to meet her too soon, never overstepped. He waited until she was ready. He let her come to him. And she did. Slowly, then all at once. She started calling him my Gavin before she ever called him anything else, and that told me everything I needed to know. Now here we were, hours away from becoming a real family. I'd spent the night at Joelle's house, mostly because Ruby insisted that tradition demanded the bride not see the groom the morning of. Gavin had kissed my hand before leaving and promised he'd be waiting, suit pressed, vows memorized. Joelle had been my lifeline during the divorce. She'd talked me out of sending emails I'd regret, out of court with mascara streaks down my face, out of giving up when things felt too hard. "You're the strongest person I know," she'd tell me, handing me a cup of black coffee like it could fix everything. She knocked on the bedroom door now, interrupting my thoughts, and walked in with a hairbrush and curling iron in one hand, 2 bagels in the other. "Eat something," she said. "You're gonna need the calories for smiling." Ruby giggled from where she was sprawled across the couch, her feet kicking in the air like a metronome. "Mommy's gonna be the most beautiful bride ever," she declared. I laughed, pulling her into my lap. "Not if I forget to eat and pass out mid-vows." The limo would be here in less than 2 hours. We were getting married in a restored chapel just off the bay, a place with high wooden ceilings and stained glass that turned sunlight into ribbons of color across the floor. It wasn't huge, only 80 guests, but every seat would be filled with people who had stuck around when things got hard. Gavin's parents were flying in from Colorado. My mom had finally forgiven me for marrying Troy and was busy making sure the flowers were arranged exactly how I wanted. Ruby had memorized her flower girl duties down to the second. Though she was still annoyed, she didn't get to carry a wand. I stepped into the bathroom and closed the door just to take a breath. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked. My hair was pinned up, makeup done, dress still hanging in the closet beside me like a promise. For the first time in years, I didn't see the girl who cried herself to sleep wondering if she'd ruined her child's life. I saw a woman who had made it through something awful and found someone worth trying again for. I saw someone who deserved to feel loved and safe. Ruby tapped on the door. "Mommy, the car is coming soon," she called. I opened it to find her with her shoes already on the wrong feet, clutching her tiny bouquet like a warrior. "I'm ready," she said. I crouched down and fixed her laces. "You're my hero, you know that," I whispered. She nodded, like it was obvious. When the car pulled up, Joelle grabbed her emergency kit, like we were going into battle, and linked her arm through mine. "Let's go get you married," she grinned. As we stepped outside, I felt a wind rise off the water, not heavy, just enough to lift my veil and make me feel like everything, finally, was going to be okay. The chapel looked like something out of a dream. Tucked between dunes and wild grasses, its white stone facade gleamed against the ocean's blue edge, and I felt my pulse quicken the second the limousine pulled up in front of it. I'd seen it in photographs a dozen times, but nothing prepared me for how it would feel to step out and see guests turning their heads, cameras flashing, Ruby clutching my hand with her tiny fingers trembling just enough to remind me how real this all was. Joelle adjusted my veil one last time before we stepped through the courtyard, whispering, "You've got this," like a mantra. Inside, soft classical music echoed under high wooden beams, and flower petals lined the aisle like a path through a storybook. Ruby looked up at me, eyes wide with awe, and asked in a hushed voice, "Are we really a family now?" And I almost broke down right there, but I managed a nod and a smile, bending down to brush her cheek. "Yes, baby. Today changes everything." Guests turned as the music shifted, the organ growing louder, and I gave Ruby a gentle nudge. She stepped forward, careful with each movement, scattering cream and blush petals from her basket, lips pursed in the kind of concentration only a 6-year-old could summon. Some people chuckled softly, others smiled with misty eyes, and I watched Gavin kneel as she approached, whisper something that made her giggle before she took her seat near the altar. Then it was Joelle's turn, moving gracefully down the aisle in her dusty lilac dress, clutching the bouquet she'd arranged herself from flowers picked out months earlier during one of our long, hopeful brunches. Then it was me. The chapel doors opened wider, and sunlight spilled in like a flood. I stepped forward, alone for just a beat, the dress swaying around my legs, my breath caught halfway between awe and disbelief. I saw Gavin at the altar, eyes already wet, mouth just slightly parted like he couldn't believe I was real. I met his eyes and everything else, every whisper, every camera flash, every memory that tried to claw its way back, melted into background noise. We'd made it. We were here. Father Bennett began the ceremony in a warm, grounded voice, one that carried over the pews like the breeze from outside. "We gather here not just to witness love, but to honor its power to rebuild," he said, and I swear half the guests exhaled at once like someone had named the collective ache we all carried. Gavin squeezed my hand, his thumb brushing against the base of mine in steady, grounding circles. The vows came quickly, faster than I expected, and I hadn't cried until I heard his. "Marla," he said, voice steady despite the emotion welling behind it. "I didn't believe in second chances until you sat next to me in that circle, arms crossed like you'd rather be anywhere else. You brought light back into rooms I thought would stay dark forever." By the time he finished, my hands were shaking. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and leaned into everything I'd never been able to say before. Gavin, I whispered, you never tried to fix me. You just stood beside me until I remembered how to stand on my own. There wasn't a dry eye in the front rows. Ruby sat completely still, bouquet now in her lap, watching us with quiet, serious wonder, like she understood we weren't just getting married. We were choosing her too. Then came the rings. Joel handed mine over with a wink, and Gavin slid it onto my finger, his hands still warm despite the chill in the chapel. The diamond caught the sunlight just as Ruby stood up, pulling slightly at her sash. I heard the fabric rustle, turned my head, and saw her shifting on her feet. "Mommy," she whispered, barely loud enough for anyone but me to hear, "I need the bathroom." I smiled, reached for her hand, and leaned down. "Can you wait just a little longer?" She nodded, but I could see the fidgeting start. She sat again, legs swinging. We kissed. The applause rose like a wave. Father Bennett introduced us, Mr. and Mrs. Gavin and Marla, and for a moment, everything felt surreal, like I'd been dropped into someone else's perfect ending. We stepped outside for photos, Ruby back to skipping now that the formalities were over, Joel cracking jokes with the photographer, who introduced himself as Cal. Just Cal, no last name. He was quick and calm, the kind of guy who made it easy to forget there was a camera pointed at you. "Let's start with some soft shots of just the two of you," he said, positioning us near the stone railing that overlooked the water. The breeze kicked up again, catching my veil and whipping it softly around my shoulders. I leaned into Gavin, head on his chest, as Cal snapped away. "Let's bring in Ruby," Cal said after a few minutes, waving her over. Ruby came running, but her expression had changed. That bright spark had dimmed just a little. "Are you okay?" I asked, brushing a finger under her chin. "My tummy's weird," she said softly, glancing down at her shoes. "I think it's just too long." I hugged her against my side. "We're almost done, baby. Then we can change and rest." She nodded, but then said something I couldn't quite process right away. "Mommy, can I go inside your dress? Just for a second. Like hide and seek." I gave a startled laugh, then saw that she was already crouching, lifting the edge of my gown before I could respond. A few guests chuckled. Gavin looked over, half amused, half exasperated. "Soft, let's play games after photos, yeah?" But Cal raised his hand. "Actually, this is adorable. Candid, playful shots. Let's go with it." I sighed, shaking my head. "Okay, but don't move too much." She grinned and ducked beneath the silk, disappearing into the flare of fabric near my feet. I posed again, awkwardly at first, but we laughed through it. Then I felt something shift, not just in the dress, but in the air. A rustling came from underneath me. Then stillness. Then Ruby's voice, soft, confused, not playful at all. "Mommy." I crouched immediately, heart stuttering. "What is it, honey?" She emerged, her face serious, brows drawn tight in concern. Her hand uncurled to reveal something I didn't recognize at first, small, black, with thin wires curling like veins from its side. It looked like a misplaced hearing aid. "This was inside," she whispered. My breath caught. I took it from her, holding it in my palm. Gavin leaned over and stiffened instantly. "That's a mic," he said. "And that's a lens. This is surveillance equipment." His voice had gone flat, dead calm. My heart thudded hard. Cal lowered his camera. Joel stepped forward. "What the hell is going on?" Gavin pulled me aside. "This is professional grade, not something you buy at Radio Shack." I looked down at Ruby, who was now clinging to Joel's leg, her earlier joy replaced with uncertainty. My whole body felt ice cold. "Are we being recorded right now?" I asked. Gavin didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward Cal. "Stop shooting. Now." My voice trembled as I turned back toward the crowd, still blissfully unaware. "Gavin, someone planted this in my dress." He nodded once, jaw tight. "And we need to call the police right now." The chapel emptied slower than I expected, whispers trailing behind confused guests as they wandered into the afternoon sunlight, trying to make sense of the strange tension that had overtaken the celebration. Ruby sat on the small couch in the bridal lounge, her feet swinging gently while Joelle offered her juice and tried to make her laugh. But even at 6 years old, my daughter could sense that something serious had shattered the mood. Gavin paced back and forth in front of the window, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and sharp as he gave our location to the local police dispatcher, using words like tampering, espionage, and unauthorized surveillance. While I stared blankly at the twisted piece of tech Ruby had found sewn into the hem of my wedding dress. It looked so small, almost delicate, with wires thinner than dental floss and a tiny lens that glinted whenever it caught the light. But the implications were massive and terrifying. I kept replaying the moment she handed it to me, her face confused but calm, like she'd just found a strange coin in the grass. If she hadn't gone crawling around under my dress like a playful kitten, we might never have known, at least not until it was far too late. A knock on the door snapped me out of my spiral. A woman with a headset and clipboard, Amanda, the chapel coordinator, peeked her head in and asked if everything was okay. Gavin opened the door fully and gestured her inside. "We're dealing with a potential crime," he said calmly. "Please clear the rest of the building and hold all staff in place. No one leaves." Amanda's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. "Understood," she said before disappearing again. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car rolled up outside the chapel, followed closely by an unmarked vehicle. Two officers stepped out, one in his late 40s with a detective's badge clipped to his belt, the other younger and visibly tense. "I'm Detective Ames," the older one said as he stepped inside. "This is Officer Klein. We received a report about unauthorized surveillance." Gavin handed him the device without hesitation. "My daughter found this sewn inside the bride's dress during the wedding photos. We suspect there may be more." I watched Detective Ames inspect it, his brow furrowing immediately. "This isn't amateur work," he muttered. "These models are military adjacent. Expensive. Hard to get your hands on." He looked up at me. "Do you mind if we examine the dress in more detail?" I nodded mutely and moved behind the privacy screen, Joelle helping me step out of the gown carefully while the officers kept their backs turned. We laid the dress across the long couch, the train spilling over the edge like a snowdrift. A forensic tech, Sarah, a woman with neat braids and gloves already on, arrived moments later with a portable kit and began scanning the fabric with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, she found another mic buried in the bodice seam, then another near the waist, two more in the train, one at the shoulder, then three ultra-small cameras along the inner lining, all carefully sewn into the design where no one would suspect a thing. 10 devices total, Sarah confirmed, sewn in with professional technique. Someone wanted to record everything without detection. I felt my stomach twist so hard I had to sit down. "Who would do this?" I whispered. Gavin crouched in front of me, taking my hands. "We'll find out. I promise." Detective Ames flipped open a notebook. "Where did you get the dress?" "A boutique in Houston," I replied. "It's called Seraphine Bridal. My final fitting was 3 weeks ago." He made a note. "Anyone at the shop act suspicious?" I shook my head. Everyone was professional. The seamstress, Delia, was especially attentive. She even called me personally to confirm the hemline adjustment. Just then, Amanda returned, her face tight with worry. "I just spoke to Delia," she said. "She's here. She came to help steam the veil before the ceremony. When I told her the police were involved, she said she needed to speak with you right away." Delia stepped inside moments later, her eyes red, hands shaking. She didn't wait to be prompted. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice cracking. "I didn't know what else to do." Ames gestured for her to sit. "Start from the beginning." Delia collapsed onto a nearby chair and buried her face in her hands for a moment before speaking. "A man came to the shop about a month ago. He said his name was Troy. He told me he was the bride's ex-husband and that he needed help with something private. He offered me money, $50,000 at first. Said it was just to install a tracking device inside the dress. Nothing harmful, just a precaution." I said no. He came back the next day and offered $100,000. He said I could pay off all my debts and finally get my dad into a treatment program for his condition. When he raised it to 150, I gave in. I didn't know there would be cameras too. I couldn't speak. I just stared at her, heart pounding. 50,000? 150? "Troy doesn't have that kind of money," I said finally. Delia nodded. "He said his fiancée was paying. Camille Davis. Her family owns some oil and gas firm. She was the one backing the deal." Gavin's jaw clenched. So Troy was planning to spy on his ex-wife's new life to dig up dirt. To try to take Ruby. Delia nodded, crying harder now. He said he needed evidence that Marla was unstable, that she would snap during the honeymoon, that she'd yell at the kid, or get drunk, or I don't know. He said one bad clip could flip custody in his favor. I could hardly breathe. My hands were ice cold. Ruby was playing with Joelle's earrings across the room, oblivious to the storm around her. I felt rage rise like a fire in my throat, but it was tangled up in grief. He wanted to use my daughter like a pawn. I whispered. He wanted to destroy us from the inside out. Detective Ames stood. We need his current address. Delia reached into her bag and produced a business card with Troy's details. He gave me this in case I had questions. Ames took it and nodded. We'll handle it. Thank you for cooperating. Delia stood and turned to me. I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I didn't know what I was doing until it was too late. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart had curled into something small and armored. Gavin stepped closer, wrapped an arm around me. You did the right thing coming forward, he said coldly, and that was the end of it. 2 hours later, we got the call Troy had been arrested at his rented condo downtown. They'd found surveillance plans, maps of the chapel, transcripts of text messages between him and Camille. There were folders labeled honeymoon targets and custody strategy. His new fiancée had wired the money in 4 separate installments under false business names. Detective Ames returned to the chapel with the update. It's worse than we thought, he said. He wasn't just trying to spy. He was building a whole case, fabricating a narrative. There's even a script outlining how to manipulate Ruby's perception of Gavin over time. I didn't cry. Not then. There wasn't room for sadness anymore, only fury. Ruby ran up to me as we left the lounge, clutched my hand, and said, Mommy, are the bad people gone now? And I looked down at her brave little face and said, Yes, sweetheart. They're never coming near you again. The courtroom smelled like dust and anxiety. Thick, stale air hanging between polished benches and fluorescent lights that made everything feel colder than it was. I sat beside Gavin, our hands locked tightly under the table, while Ruby colored quietly in the hallway with Joelle, too young to be inside but old enough to sense something life-altering was happening nearby. On the other side of the aisle, Troy sat slouched behind his attorney, in a borrowed suit he clearly hadn't tailored, his expression unreadable except for the slightest twitch whenever the prosecution brought up Ruby's name. I'd imagined this moment for months, how it would feel to watch him finally answer for everything. But the reality felt oddly hollow, like my body couldn't catch up to the weight of what was unfolding around me. Judge Keller's voice cut through the silence, crisp and unflinching as he read through the charges. Unlawful surveillance, endangerment of a minor, bribery, and intent to obstruct a custodial agreement. Each count hit like a hammer, but Troy didn't flinch until the judge mentioned Camille Davis by name, stating that her involvement in funding the operation had led to a parallel civil case, which her family was now scrambling to settle quietly out of court. It turned out Camille had no idea Troy's real intentions went beyond monitoring behavior. She thought she was protecting her future stepchild from an unstable mother, and when she discovered the truth, she'd filed for annulment and returned to her family's estate in Louisiana, cutting all ties. I stared at the back of Troy's head and wondered how someone I once loved could become so monstrous. There had been a time when he made me laugh so hard my stomach hurt, when I thought he'd be the kind of father who read bedtime stories and built tree houses. But that man had been an illusion, a mask worn by someone who saw family as a possession rather than a bond. The prosecutor presented the evidence like building blocks, each more damning than the last. Surveillance plans, diagrams of the wedding chapel, financial records showing 4 wire transfers from Camille's family trust, a spreadsheet labeled custody leverage, with tabs for emotional manipulation, psychological triggers, and projected outcomes. I thought I was going to be sick, but I forced myself to stay seated, to keep my jaw steady and my shoulders straight. Gavin didn't speak, but I felt the subtle tightening of his grip with every new revelation. Then came the testimonies. Delia took the stand first, trembling, her voice cracking but resolute as she confessed her part in the scheme. She didn't excuse it. She didn't try to hide behind her father's illness or her desperation. She just told the truth, raw and unfiltered. When the defense tried to paint her as an unreliable witness, she simply looked toward me and said, "I would do anything to take it back. I never wanted to hurt her. I just didn't know how to say no." I didn't cry, not even when she looked down and covered her face afterward. Then Detective Ames testified, laying out how the investigation led directly to Troy's apartment, where they recovered flash drives containing hours of planned audio manipulation, including sample conversations that had been edited to sound incriminating. The jury listened in stiff silence as snippets were played. Fake arguments, manufactured outbursts, even voice clips of me cut from old voicemails and stitched into new contexts. I watched them squirm, and I hoped they understood just how deep Troy's obsession ran. Finally, it was my turn. The courtroom hushed as I stepped onto the stand, hands cold but heart pounding like a war drum. I spoke clearly, without theatrics. I told them how Troy changed when I began to succeed professionally, how his affection became possessiveness, then resentment, then outright control. I described the divorce, the late-night threats, the gaslighting, and how he twisted Ruby's routines to make me look unreliable. But I saved the most important part for last. "He didn't just try to hurt me," I said, locking eyes with the jurors. "He tried to take my daughter's future and twist it into something calculated. He used her innocence as a weapon, and if she hadn't found that device, he might have succeeded." I paused. "She's 6 years old. She shouldn't have to be anyone's shield. But that day, she was mine." When I stepped down, my knees felt weak, but Gavin caught me instantly, steadying me as I passed him. Judge Keller called a short recess, and I slipped out into the hallway where Ruby sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing a picture of our family under a tree. She looked up, noticed my face, and smiled like nothing bad could ever touch her. "Is it almost done?" she asked, and I nodded. "Almost." When court resumed, Troy's defense team made a last-minute plea for leniency, citing mental health issues and claiming he had been manipulated by Camille's powerful family. But the judge didn't bite. "Mr. Troy Adams," he began, "you not only violated the law, you violated the sanctity of a child's trust. Your actions were deliberate, premeditated, and cruel. You treated your daughter like a bargaining chip." He was sentenced to 6 years in prison without parole. As the gavel struck, I felt the air shift, like something invisible had finally uncoiled from around my chest. Ruby wouldn't know the details until she was older, but she would know she was safe, and that was enough. Custody was awarded to me exclusively. Troy was barred from any contact, physical or digital, until Ruby turned 18, and even then only if she requested it herself. Gavin was approved as her legal guardian, pending final paperwork, which we planned to complete the following week. The court officers escorted Troy out of the room in cuffs, and for a moment, he turned to look back, but I didn't meet his eyes. He didn't deserve that much. Delia received a suspended sentence, along with mandated community service and psychological counseling. She approached me quietly afterward, outside the courthouse, with tears in her eyes and hands shaking. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, "but I want you to know I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be better." I didn't say much. I just nodded once and watched her walk away, her silhouette smaller than I remembered. That night, back at home, we didn't talk much. We curled up on the couch with Ruby between us, her head resting against Gavin's chest as they watched cartoons. I stared at the flickering screen and thought about everything that had happened, every threat, every lie, every twist of fear that had nearly swallowed me whole. But Ruby was safe. Gavin was beside me. And tomorrow, we'd wake up in a house free of secrets. That was more than I ever thought I'd have again. 3 months passed like fog lifting from the bay, slow at first, then suddenly clear, until one day I looked out our kitchen window and realized I wasn't holding my breath anymore. The house we moved into sat on a quiet street just inland from the harbor, shaded by tall oaks that dropped leaves like whispers onto the porch, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it felt like a home, not just a place to hide. Gavin and I spent those first weeks rebuilding from the inside out, painting rooms, fixing squeaky cabinets, establishing bedtime rituals for Ruby that she insisted must include stories, hugs, and the phrase "love team," whispered between us like a secret handshake. Ruby adjusted faster than I expected. After the courtroom storm and everything leading up to it, I worried she might retreat into herself, but instead, she bloomed. I caught her singing to herself while brushing her teeth, naming her stuffed animals after constellations, and drawing pictures of Gavin with exaggerated muscles and superhero capes. He's strong enough to carry our house, she told me one evening. Gavin just laughed and scooped her up with ease like she weighed nothing at all, spinning her in a circle until she shrieked with laughter. We decided to hold the real wedding quietly, no photographers, no decorations worth more than groceries. Just 20 people we trusted gathered in a modest chapel at the edge of town. Joelle found the place. It used to be an old fishing lodge converted into a community space, with faded blue pews and salt-bleached windows that caught the light just right. I didn't wear the original dress, of course. That gown was boxed and donated anonymously to a women's shelter thrift store, or maybe someone else could give it a gentler second life. This time I chose something simple, off-white with a clean silhouette and no lace, no secrets. Ruby wore a new flower girl dress. Yellow this time because she said white's already had its turn. Joelle arrived early, carrying a bag of bagels and 2 thermoses of coffee, giving me a hug that nearly knocked the veil off my head. "Now we do it the right way," she said. Gavin's best friend, Leon, brought his dog in a bow tie and cried more than anyone else, which we all teased him about during the vows. The only decorations were wildflowers Ruby picked from the side of the road, tied with leftover ribbon from her art box. Gavin stood waiting at the front of the chapel in a shirt that Ruby picked because it had nice shoulder lines. And when he saw me walking in with Ruby on one side and Joelle on the other, he smiled like he hadn't done anything else in his life, but wait for that exact moment. There were no dramatic readings or long speeches this time. Just us standing in the sunlit silence, promising each other the kind of loyalty that can't be bought or faked or forced into existence. When the pastor asked if we wanted to say personal vows, I nodded. "Gavin," I said, "you taught me that love isn't about starting over. It's about growing through the mess. You never tried to fix my past. You just made space for a future I never thought I'd get again." His voice was low but steady when he answered. "Marla, you walked into my grief like you weren't afraid of the dark. You gave me light, not by trying to erase what came before, but by letting me remember how to live again." Ruby stood between us for the ring exchange, holding the velvet box with both hands like it was a sacred treasure, and after Gavin placed the ring on my finger, she grinned and shouted, "Now we're real married." Everyone laughed, even the pastor, who pronounced us husband and wife with the softest smile. After the ceremony, we walked to the little picnic area outside the chapel, where folding chairs circled around a fire pit and plates of home-cooked food waited on folding tables. Ruby sat on Gavin's lap for most of it, chattering about her new school and how she wanted a puppy, but only if it knows how to behave like a gentleman. Gavin promised they'd discuss dog rules over the weekend. I sat beside them, watching as Ruby leaned her head on Gavin's chest and closed her eyes, and I knew in that moment that everything we'd fought through had been worth it. Joelle tapped her glass gently with a fork. "I just want to say," she began, "that watching Marla go from barely holding it together to this calm, stubborn, joyful version of herself, it's been one of the greatest things I've ever witnessed." I raised my drink and tried not to cry, but of course I did anyway. Weeks passed. Ruby's drawings began featuring 3 people instead of 2. Gavin's old guest room became an office/playroom. I picked up more clients for my design work. Life didn't explode with excitement, but it grew rich in the smallest places. Grocery runs turned into family walks. Movie nights became weekly rituals. Ruby made us pinky promise that Saturday pancakes were law now. There were still hard days, flashbacks, moments where fear crept in like smoke, but they no longer owned us. We'd built something stronger than the shadows. Then one afternoon, Ruby came home from school with a storybook in her backpack titled "Families Come in All Shapes," and she asked if she could write her own version. She sat at the kitchen table, tongue sticking out between her lips as she scribbled. When she was done, she handed it to me and said, "Read it out loud." The cover said, "My Family, a Real Hero Story." Page 1 had stick figures, me, Gavin, and her, holding hands under a crooked rainbow. The last page just said, "Love wins." Later that night, As we sat on the back porch with the sounds of cicadas in the trees, Gavin said softly, "Do you think she'll remember everything?" I looked at him and answered, "She'll remember that we protected her, that we chose her, that no one ever took that from her." He nodded. "Then we did everything right. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding from dreams I can't quite explain, but I always roll over and find Gavin there, breathing steady, warm beside me, and the fear disappears." And in the next room, Ruby sleeps surrounded by her drawings, her superhero dolls, and the quiet certainty that she is loved more than anything in the world. We didn't get the perfect wedding the first time, but we got something better. We got a second chance that no one could steal. A family built not out of obligation or illusion, but out of trust, honesty, and choice. That's more than I could have hoped for when everything was falling apart. That's our real beginning.